The conference room at Harold Green's Boston law office felt less like a place for justice and more like a battlefield waiting for its first shot. 25 people were crammed into a space built for half that number. Shoulders pressed tight, whispers ricocheting off the paneled walls. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and expensive perfume, but underneath was something sharper, sourer greed. I could feel it pulsing through the room like a second heartbeat. Victor, the eldest son, checked his phone every 30 seconds, as if a board meeting was more important than his mother's final words. Elaine. His wife sat beside him, with her arms crossed, whispering into the ear of her financial advisor, while casting icy glances toward the podium. Bernard, cane in hand, slouched 2 rows back, the glint of a flask flashing each time he lifted it to his lips. And Miranda, the failed actress, the youngest, dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue, but her gaze never left the leather folder in front of Harold. Before I go on, let me pause for you. If you've ever been in a room where money tore a family apart, you know how it feels. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you seen greed turn love into something ugly? And if you're watching from Boston, Chicago, Phoenix, or anywhere else in the world, drop your city below. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the stories that cut this deep. My name is Jonah Hayes. I'm 34 years old, a construction foreman by trade. I'm not a banker like Victor, or a gambler like Bernard, or a dreamer clinging to spotlights like Miranda. I build things that last steel concrete walls that don't crumble when the first storm rolls in. And for the last year, I've lived with my grandmother, Clara Montrose, the woman whose empire of hotels stretched from Boston Harbor to Miami Beach. To me, she wasn't a tycoon. She was simply Grandma Clara, the woman who taught me that the strength of a home is not in the marble floors, but in the hands that built it. Now, in this suffocating room, I sat in the back watching the parade of familiar strangers. Behind the immediate family lurked outsiders, Miranda's boy-toy boyfriend too young to hide his smirk, and Lucas, a cousin I'd never met before today, already taking notes like a reporter scenting blood. They leaned forward, eyes sharp, as if Harold would spill the location of buried treasure at any moment. The silence was fragile, like a glass stretched too thin. Every sigh, every shuffle of papers seemed loud enough to crack it. I felt my stomach knot, not because I wanted her fortune. I already knew money poisoned more than it healed, but because I understood the storm that was about to break. Grandma Clara had never done anything the way people expected, and I knew in my bones she wouldn't start now, Victor muttered under his breath. This better not take long, his Rolex catching the light as he drummed the table. Elaine's lips curled in a smirk. I'd seen at cocktail parties, smug rehearsed empty. Bernard's flask slipped clattering to the floor, drawing sharp stares and a burst of muffled laughter. Miranda hushed them theatrically, hand on her chest, like she was auditioning for a role. And me, I sat perfectly still, hands folded, waiting. Because I remembered what Grandma whispered just days before she died, Jonah. The truth doesn't hide forever. It always rises. Watch how they reveal themselves. That whisper echoed now as Harold Green stepped through the doorway, leather folder tucked under his arm. The chatter died instantly. A hush fell so complete, I could hear the tick of Victor's watch. Every eye followed Harold to the podium. My pulse quickened, because this wasn't just the reading of a will. This was the opening act of a reckoning. As Harold laid the folder on the podium, my chest tightened, but instead of focusing on the angry faces around me, my mind drifted back to those last weeks with Grandma Clara. It's strange how memory works. You think you're in the present, but one smell, one sound pulls you straight into another room, another time. She was already frail then, lungs betrayed by the cancer eating her from the inside out. Yet she moved with the same quiet authority that had built a hotel empire out of nothing. I can still see her sitting in her favorite armchair by the window of the Sea View Hotel, the very first property she ever owned. The Atlantic stretched out before us, gray and endless, the tide rolling like it had secrets of its own. She would sip her tea slowly, as if buying herself time, then start talking, her voice a mixture of rasp and resolve. Jonah. She told me one evening, her hand resting lightly on mine when I started. It was just a roadside inn with 5 rooms. Your grandfather had just passed, and I had 3 children to feed. Everyone said I was foolish that a widow with no money and no allies couldn't possibly survive in this business. She gave a short laugh, half bitter, half triumphant. But I did. I survived every storm, every betrayal, until now. I wanted to argue to tell her she'd beat this too, but her eyes stopped me. They weren't defeated. They were steady knowing. Those nights, blurred together oxygen machines humming softly, the smell of antiseptic mixing with salt air sneaking through the half-open window. Beside her was Grace, the nurse, who had become more like family than any of her own children. Grace had a way of anticipating Clara's needs before she spoke them, adjusting pillows, checking vitals, or just sitting in silence when silence was all Clara wanted. Sometimes I caught Grandma watching Grace with a look that reminded me of how she used to watch me as a boy, proud, protective, quietly grateful. One night, when Grace had stepped out to fetch more medication, Clara whispered, "She's the daughter I never had, Jonah. Not by blood, but by loyalty. Remember that." I nodded, though my throat closed too tight to speak. In those final weeks, the conversations turned from business to something heavier. She told me about the Depression years when dinner was watered-down potato soup about stitching shoes from cardboard to keep her children warm. She admitted the crushing loneliness of making her first million alone in a hotel room while her sons were too busy chasing pleasures to notice. And then she would fall quiet, staring at the ocean, as if it held an answer she'd been chasing all her life. On one of those evenings, just as the sun melted into the water, she said something I can never forget. "The truth always finds its way back, Jonah. Even when people bury it, even when they hide it under lies or money, it rises just like the tide." She squeezed my hand, then her skin paper-thin, but her grip surprisingly strong. Now, sitting in that crowded law office, her words echoed louder than the tick of Victor's watch or the scrape of Bernard's cane. The vultures around me thought they were about to feast. They had no idea that the tide Grandma spoke of was already rising, and when it broke, it would sweep away everything they thought they deserved. The tide of her words hadn't even faded from my memory before the storm began. It started with Victor. He arrived one morning in a Navy suit so stiff it looked like armor, carrying a stack of papers under his arm. He didn't bother with hello. He walked straight into Grandma's study as though he owned the place. "Mother," he said, his voice sharp, clipped. "We need to get these documents in order. It's the only way to protect the estate from unnecessary taxes. Sign here and here." Grandma Clara studied the papers with eyes that had negotiated hotel contracts tougher than any government deal. Her thin fingers slid across the page, pausing at a line that transferred power of attorney to Victor immediately. She closed the folder, her expression calm but unyielding. "Victor," she said softly, "I have cancer, not dementia. I will not hand over my life's work to someone who treats it like numbers on a ledger." His jaw tightened. "I'm trying to help you." "No," she replied, her voice like steel under velvet. You're trying to help yourself." The silence afterward was heavier than any shout. He gathered the papers, shoved them back into his briefcase, and stormed out, his shoes echoing across the marble floor. I watched from the hall, feeling the sting of her rejection wasn't for him alone, but for all the ways he had already abandoned her. Then came Miranda. Unlike Victor, she understood optics. She swept in with a camera crew, claiming she wanted to honor the only mother she had left. She draped an arm around Grandma's frail shoulders, whispering loud enough for microphones to catch. "You've always been my guiding light." Flashbulbs popped while Grandma forced a thin smile. Later, when the crew left, Clara's hands trembled. "She never visits unless there's a spotlight," she muttered. She asked me to write down the date in her red leather journal. Page after page, the journal filled with small betrayals. Bernard's turn came in the middle of the night. A pounding shook the front door at midnight, followed by the slurred bark of my uncle's voice. I opened it to find him swaying on the porch, the stench of bourbon wrapping around him. "I need 50,000, he demanded, jabbing a finger into my chest. "The trucking company's sinking. She's sitting on millions while her son drowns." "You're drunk," I said, blocking the doorway. His eyes narrowed, red-rimmed and furious. "You think you're the good grandson? You're nothing but a leech in waiting." Grandma heard it all from upstairs. Later, I found her sitting at her desk pen, scratching against that same red journal. The look on her face wasn't anger, it was heartbreak. And then there was Lucas, the cousin I barely knew. He prowled the house like a thief, slipping into offices when he thought no one was watching. I caught him once with a file in his hands. Just curious, he smirked, but I saw the camera in his pocket, the greed in his eyes. I later learned he was shopping stories to tabloids, eager to sell our family's shame for a paycheck. Each encounter carved another line into Grandma's face, but she never stopped documenting. "If they won't remember who they were," she whispered one night, closing the red journal, "then I will." After Bernard's drunken outburst and Lucas's prowling, I thought I had seen every shade of greed. But Grandma Clara wasn't rattled. If anything, she grew sharper, quieter, as if all the disappointment only steeled her resolve. That was when Harold Green began visiting more often. One gray February morning, his Lincoln pulled into the driveway. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and the solemn air of a man about to witness something final. Clara, dressed in her navy suit, though she could barely stand, greeted him in the study. Grace helped her to the chair, adjusted her scarf, then closed the curtains. The door shut, and the lock clicked. I wasn't invited inside. For 6 hours, I lingered in the hallway, listening through the wood. Papers rustled, pens scratched across thick pages the low baritone of Harold's questions, and now and then the ragged cough of my grandmother. Every sound pressed against me like a secret I wasn't supposed to know. When the door finally opened, Harold emerged, pale but composed. He put a hand on my shoulder. "Your grandmother is a remarkable woman, Jonah," he said, his eyes unreadable. "Remember that." Then he left without another word. Grace stayed behind, tidying up the study. Later, as we brewed tea in the kitchen, she whispered, "She asked us to record her testimony. Not just the will, her reasons. She wanted it on camera so no one could twist her voice after she's gone." Grace paused, her eyes glistening. She said the truth deserved witnesses. That night I found Clara at her desk, surrounded by envelopes sealed in red wax. She looked up at me, a faint smile tugging her lips. "Insurance," she said simply. Her hand moved slowly, but with purpose, as she addressed each letter, Victor, Bernard, Miranda, even Lucas. There was one for Grace, too, and one for me, though she slid mine into a separate drawer. Why all this, I asked. Her pen stopped. She gazed at the ocean through the window, its waves dark under the moonlight. "Because when the tide comes in Jonah, It needs to wash everything clean. Not just money, memory, motive, all of it. I didn't press further, but unease gnawed at me. She wasn't just preparing for death, she was orchestrating something larger, a reckoning I couldn't yet see. As she sealed the final envelope, she reached for her red journal, the one already heavy with betrayal. She slipped it into the bottom drawer, locked it, and exhaled. The sound wasn't relief. It was determination. I went to bed that night unable to shake the feeling. The house was silent, except for the distant crash of waves. But in that silence, I felt the weight of something building a fuse already lit. And I knew when it burned down, it would not be a gentle ending. It would be an explosion. The silence of that night still haunted me when Harold called us together weeks later. His office, usually a place of quiet law and order, had transformed into an overcrowded theater. Every seat was taken, people pressed against the walls, hungry for their share of what they believed was theirs by birthright. The air buzzed with greed like static before a storm. Harold stepped to the front leather folder tucked under his arm. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but firm. This document was executed with full legal capacity and witnessed by multiple professionals. It cannot be contested. The words landed like stones dropped into water. A ripple of unease spread through the room. Victor leaned forward, a smile tugging at his lips, as though his victory was already certain. But when Harold pulled out the first envelope, that smile froze. To my son, Victor Montrose. Harold read, adjusting his glasses. I leave my father's pocket watch. May it remind you of all the time you spent chasing fortune instead of family. The room stilled. Victor's jaw clenched. He held out his hand, and when the tarnished watch was placed in it, he stared as though it were a slap across the face. Harold continued. To my son Bernard, I leave this empty whiskey bottle. You drank away opportunity, trust, and love. May this stand as a mirror for the hollowness you carried. Bernard lurched to his feet, his face blotched red. This is a joke, he roared. But Harold ignored him, his voice calm and relentless. To my daughter Miranda, I leave an unfinished play I once found in your desk. Dreams mean nothing without discipline. Perhaps now you'll understand the difference between fantasy and life. Miranda pressed the script against her chest, eyes darting for cameras that weren't there. Her painted smile cracked, slipping into something brittle. Then came Elaine. Harold's tone didn't falter. To Elaine, wife of Victor, I leave my collection of imitation jewels. They sparkle brightly but are worth nothing much like the affection you showed me. Gasps broke the air. Elaine's hand flew to the pearls at her throat. She hissed under her breath. How dare she? Finally, Harold reached for the smallest envelope, his gaze sharp. And to my nephew, Lucas. A hush fell. I leave this clipping from the Boston Herald dated 1983. An article detailing how your father betrayed his business partner to save himself. May you learn that bloodlines carry both wealth and shame. Lucas paled. The envelope slipped from his fingers. Murmurs rose like a storm tide, filling the room with anger and disbelief. Voices clashed chairs, scraped fists, slammed on tables. Victor demanded the real will. Bernard cursed. Miranda sobbed. Elaine spat venom. Lucas cursed the dead. The conference room became a riot of accusation and denial, and I sat in the corner watching chaos unfold, remembering Clara's words. When the tide comes in, Jonah, it washes everything clean. The tide had begun. The shouting rose to a fever pitch, a storm of rage and disbelief rattling the walls of Harold's office. Victor slammed the table with his fist. Enough games. Where's the real inheritance? Where's the 52 million? The room went dead still. All eyes snapping toward Harold. He didn't flinch. He opened the final section of the folder, the leather creaking under his deliberate movements. His voice when it came was calm, almost reverent. 3 years before her passing, Mrs. Clara Montrose sold the entire hotel group. Every property, every share, every investment. She liquidated her empire into $52 million in cash. Gasps cut through the silence. Bernard's cane clattered to the floor. Miranda whispered, 52 million, as if tasting the number. Harold continued his tone unyielding. 35 million has been placed into a scholarship fund for underprivileged medical students. 10 million has been allocated to the construction of a women's shelter and support center here in Boston. 5 million has gone to orphan relief charities across New England. 1.5 million has been entrusted to Grace Holloway to establish a community clinic in her name. Grace, sitting quietly in the back, covered her mouth, eyes flooding. She shook her head, whispering, "No, she didn't." But she had. Elaine leapt to her feet. "This is theft. She had no right." Harold's gaze sharpened. She had every right. It was her fortune. And she made her choices with full clarity of mind. The air crackled fury, choking the oxygen. But Harold wasn't finished. He pulled out one more envelope, this one smaller, sealed in red wax. His eyes met mine before he spoke. "And finally to my grandson, Jonah Hayes. She leaves the key to room 101, the very first room of the Seaview Inn, the place where she began her journey. With it, she leaves these words, 'You know the true value of a home, Jonah. It isn't marble or gold. It's the shelter it gives, the love it holds, the life it protects.'" My hand shook as he placed the old brass key in my palm. Its weight was nothing, yet it carried the gravity of her entire legacy. I saw for a moment the image of her sitting by the ocean, telling me that truth always rises. Victor stood, his face purple with rage. She gave it all away to strangers, to beggars, to charity, and left us scraps. But Harold didn't answer. He simply closed the folder and stepped back, letting the silence speak for itself. In that moment, I realized the fortune wasn't lost. It had been transformed, redirected. She hadn't taken it from them. She'd freed it from them, releasing it into the world where it could finally mean something. The storm of voices erupted again, curses and threats flying like shards of glass. But I sat frozen, the cool metal of the key pressing into my skin, knowing that this was the moment she had prepared me for. The tide had come in, and it had swept everything away. The room was still echoing with curses when Harold dismissed us, but the damage was already done. Clara's choices were final, and nothing any of them screamed could change it. The key in my hand felt warm now, as if it carried her heartbeat, while the rest of the family left the office with eyes blazing and fists clenched. That day was the beginning of their unraveling. Victor struck first. Within weeks, he filed a lawsuit claiming fraud, undue influence, anything his lawyers could twist. But Clara had been meticulous, every signature witnessed, every video recorded. The court threw the case out faster than I expected. News traveled, and so did shame. A headline on the Boston Globe read, "Banker Victor Montrose loses fight against mother's will." Clients fled his bank in droves. By the end of the year, his empire had cracked wide open. I drove by one afternoon and saw the building stripped of its gold lettering foreclosure notices taped to the glass. Miranda tried a different escape. She flew to Paris with her much younger boyfriend, hoping for a fresh start under the glow of European lights. But money burns fast when you've never known how to earn it. Within months, tabloids plastered her face across glossy covers Montrose heiress in debt scandal. Photos showed her stumbling out of nightclubs. Mascara streaked her so-called partner, already onto the next sponsor. She called me once, her voice shaking, asking if the trust had room for her. I told her the truth. The trust was for healing, not indulgence. She hung up, without saying goodbye. Bernard's fall was slower, but crueler. His debts multiplied, creditors circling like sharks. One morning, the Boston Herald ran an exposé, 3-time failure, Montrose faces bankruptcy again. A picture of him hunched outside a courthouse spread across social media. I wish I could say I felt pity, but I remembered his midnight pounding on Clara's door, his finger stabbing into my chest. He had chosen this path. And Lucas, the cousin who thought betrayal could make him rich, disappeared altogether. He had tried to sell a fabricated story to the press, claiming Clara was manipulated in her final days. But when Harold produced her red leather journal filled with dates, details, even recordings, his lies collapsed instantly. He vanished after that, leaving nothing behind but unpaid hotel bills and a reputation stained beyond repair. While they crumbled, Grace and I poured ourselves into the clinic Clara had envisioned. I remember the first time we opened the doors, peeling paint still on the walls, the smell of fresh plaster in the air, but patients waiting nonetheless. Mothers with children, old men with failing lungs, people who had nowhere else to go. Grace's hands were steady, her voice calm just as it had been with Clara. And I was there beside her, not as a banker, not as a lawyer, not as a dreamer chasing illusions, but as someone who could build walls, fix leaks, make sure the place stood strong. The Montrose name, once synonymous with greed, was now whispered in clinic halls with gratitude. Clara had predicted it, the tide had come in, and it had washed her family clean, leaving only what mattered. The clinic became our heartbeat, but even as new walls rose and new lives were touched, one envelope haunted me, the one Harold had handed me the day of the will reading. For weeks, I couldn't bring myself to break the red wax. It sat on my desk, like a silent witness daring me to face what she had saved for me alone. One late night after the clinic's first successful month, I finally opened it. Clara's handwriting, firm even in her last days, stretched across 3 pages. My dearest Jonah, if you're reading this, it means the storm has passed and the truth has settled. Remember what I told you, wealth isn't what you lock away in safes or count in bank ledgers. True wealth lives in the hearts of those brave enough to stand on the side of what's right. You stood, and for that you will never be poor. Her words blurred through my tears. I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling as though she had stepped into the room again, her hand resting gently over mine. 2 years later, her vision had bloomed beyond anything I imagined. The scholarship fund put hundreds of first-generation students into white coats, walking hospital corridors she never lived to see. Grace's clinic had doubled in size, walls painted bright with murals of hope, patients lining up not for charity, but for dignity. And on the bluff above the Atlantic, where the Seaview Inn once stood, a new sign welcomed visitors, the Clara Montrose Legacy Museum. The first time I walked its halls, I wasn't alone. I brought a busload of children from the orphanage we now supported. Their shoes squeaked against polished wood floors, their laughter echoing under chandeliers, once reserved for the wealthy. I led them into room 101, where her first desk stood a worn ledger open to the page marked Day 1. Is this where she started? A little girl asked, clutching my sleeve. Yes, I told her. This is where she built something that lasted, and she believed it belonged to all of you, too. Later, we gathered outside on the cliff. The ocean stretched wide, restless, eternal. I stood with those children as the wind whipped around us, carrying salt and memory. And in that moment, I felt her. Not as a shadow, not as a ghost, but as presence. In the crash of the waves, in the steady breath of the tide, in the faces of children who would never know her name, yet would live within the shelter of her final gift. I closed my eyes, the brass key to room 101 still in my pocket, and whispered into the wind, "You're here, Grandma. You always will be."